difficult case. There's no doubt about it. It's a sad situation. It's a tragic situation. But your job is not to decide that. Your job is to look at the evidence and to decide whether the state has proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. In a little while, the judge is going to give you a jury instruction. And what that instruction says is that the time has come now when the great burden of reaching a just, fair, and conscientious decision of this case is to be thrown wholly upon you, the jurors. Selected for this important duty, you will not be swayed by sympathy, prejudice, or passion. You'll be very careful and deliberate in weighing the evidence. It's a really important job. But when you look at the state's case, you're going to see that there's some holes. And they have the job, they have the burden to prove their case to you beyond a reasonable doubt. Even as we sit here right now, Mr. Fuller still has the presumption of innocence, and he maintains that presumption of innocence until the state proves otherwise, until you decide otherwise. So let's talk a little bit about reasonable doubt. There's not anything that says it's, a certain number that says, oh, I've got to get to I'm 90% sure or I'm 85% sure. But I like to think of it as the big decisions that we make in our life. So when we buy a house, when we decide if we're going to marry someone, if we're going to have children with someone, even buying a car. And a reasonable doubt is a doubt for which we can give a reason. So I like that car, but every time I touch the brakes, it's something squeaking. It's making me nervous. I've got a reasonable doubt about buying this car. That house was perfect, everything looked great. Home inspector thinks the roof needs to be replaced. Not sure I want to buy that one. So those doubts that kind of keep you up at night, they keep you thinking. And you start analyzing it and thinking about it, but those are the ones that you just can't get rid of. So I want to give you a little bit of a roadmap of where I'm going to go. And I'm going to try hard to stick to that roadmap. First, I want to talk to you about what's missing. Clothing, DNA, fingerprints. I want to talk to you about some of the witness testimony that you've heard over the course of this last week. Talk about the timeline that the state has presented to you. And then to talk about the physical evidence. So let's talk about what's missing. And it's no secret that the black sweatsuit and the white shoes are missing. The police think, and the state has said, they think that Martice changed his clothes, put on a black sweatsuit, and entered the Juga home. Don't have the sweatsuit. And it's not for lack of trying. We know that they searched 4 different places that they think that Martice had a connection to. They looked in Horizon Park. They looked around Ezra's house. Detective Kennedy said, we were looking for them. We were looking hard for those clothes. We don't have them. And they don't have them to be able to test for DNA, to figure out if there's an initial on the tag that says Martice or MF. There's nothing there to be able to have those clothes to see, are these the clothes that we can see in that video? And do they belong to Martice Fuller? And there's not witnesses who say, I saw some kid changing his clothes somewhere in that park by my house. That's something that's going to draw attention. People are going to notice if someone is doing that. The police check the wet park. They don't find bike tire marks. And apparently the ground was wet enough, the state says, to have mud on shoes, but not for a bike to leave marks. You heard from an analyst from the state crime lab, Ms. Fisher, about DNA, and she told you, here's why I don't think there's DNA on this gun. She also said, though, that was all I had. I was asked to look at swabs from a gun, that was it. Not swabs from the door handle between the garage and the inside of the Juga home, not the stair railing, not anywhere else in the home to try and figure out, was someone in there and who they were, someone that didn't belong. Stephanie Juga on the 911 call said it was Martice Fuller. Police took that and they ran. They didn't try and figure out, can we get some physical evidence such as DNA, such as fingerprints, just to be sure that that's right. But they heard that name, they got tunnel vision, and off we went. So let's talk about the witnesses. Stephanie Juga testified in this case. She was going through terrible things on that day. I cannot even imagine. But I also know that when I'm going through unimaginable things and scared and frantic and panicked, I'm not at my best. And you can hear it in her voice on that 911 call. She's not sure of how old she is, and she is just distracted and panicked, and understandably so, but that's the reality of the mental state at that time. And the judge told you, when thinking about when someone identifies another person, she gave you a kind of a list of things that you should consider, and one of them is the mental state of that person. And so think about how scared, how panicked, and how distracted Stephanie was when she made that identification. And certainly at the time that she made that identification, there was a lot that had kind of led up to it. Martice Fuller was not high on anyone's list at that house, that's for sure. So he would be an easy person to assume that that's who it is. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying that that Stephanie Juga came up with this sinister plan, but when you think of where she was at that point in those moments, there's every reason to believe that she's mistaken. And we've all, I'm sure, been in situations where we've been panicked, where we've been fearful, and we all know that that is not the time when we are at our best, when we're making good decisions, and we know that our memory can be affected by that. There was also talk about cameras, and the state has gone to lengths to talk about this person in the black. They kind of hug along the house. And the state says that's because it was Martice Fuller. Martice Fuller knew that there were cameras. He knew where the bedroom and the office were, and so he wanted to be close to that house. However, we also heard testimony that there are cameras inside of the Juga house. Now, they're not always working, but we also know that they get moved around at times by Nick Juga. So if you're someone who knows the house, you know kind of what goes on in the house, and you know enough to know there's cameras on the outside, and you know other things according to the state, you're taking a big risk by going to this home with cameras on the inside. You're taking a big risk that as soon as you walk in that door from the garage, there's not going to be a camera pointed right at your face. We also know that Stephanie Juga's description of how many shots that she heard is not the same as how many casings are found within the home. And again, I think it's evidence of where she was in that moment, and that her memory is off and it's inaccurate about what happened. And you may feel a lot of sympathy and empathy for Stephanie Juga, and that is completely fine, and that is completely natural. I think that's probably the only human response that we could have. But I'm talking about her memory in those moments and the reasons to doubt her memory. So the judge is going to tell you, as I said, that your job is to evaluate the evidence, to look at the evidence, but to not be swayed by sympathy, prejudice, or passion. And so that's what I want you to do when you think about that testimony and think about the identification that was made. We also heard from Martin Torres. And Martin Torres, we know, had Martice Fuller's Facebook account up on his phone for about a month or so, and at a time when he wasn't seeing Martice. And so he had complete access to that phone. Now, Martin Torres says, I never used it, which is not surprising, but he had every ability to do that. He had complete access to that account and the ability to impersonate Martice Fuller. We know from Alexis Fertney, who is, the state says, the first person to see Martice Fuller after they say he committed murder. She doesn't see a gun. She doesn't see any blood. She doesn't see a black sweatsuit. There was Dontrell Seymour. And I will say this, that I appreciate that Dontrell was willing to kind of own it. Because he said, I lied, and I lied over and over and over. I felt like they were coming after me, and his first instinct was to lie. You heard his testimony. You heard him admit that he lied. He's not credible at all. You heard from Ann Shanice Andrews. And the important piece of Ann Shanice Andrews is that she says, I was not close with Martice. I wasn't close with his family, his father. He didn't come around family. But she says and expects us to believe that this person who was sort of a semi-estranged cousin has basically just emptied their soul to her, has told her everything, confessed to murder to her. It just doesn't make sense. Jennifer DeZoma testified, and she talked about some incidents at Bradford High School that she says that she witnessed, that were around other people, that were in areas where there also, in addition to students, there would have been staff, there would have been security cameras. And she says nobody does anything. She says Martice Fuller yanks on Kaylee Juga's ear. Nobody does anything. Nobody intervenes. He punches her in the nose and causes bleeding. Nobody does anything. Nobody says anything. Nobody notices that her nose is bleeding. It just doesn't make any sense. And I understand this is a hard situation for her. Jennifer DeZoma is dealing with issues that are well beyond what some teenagers should have to deal with. But it doesn't add up what she says she observed and what she says happened. A student assaults someone in the middle of a school and causes bleeding, and nobody notices. The state also had Brian Martinez testify from Martino's Dry Cleaning. And he says there's these phone calls, they block these phone calls. You have seen no evidence of phone records from Martino's. You've had nobody say, at least from law enforcement, nobody has said, okay, the number that called Martino's was this number. We know that this number is Martice Fuller's, and this is how we know that. You didn't hear any of that. And you heard a bunch of witnesses say Martice didn't have a phone or a phone that functions as a phone. He had Wi-Fi. Desiree Flores Wyrock, she's got her own problems right now. She made some additions to her statement after she had been charged with crimes and after she was meeting with the DA's office, the same one that was prosecuting her and is prosecuting her again. And she understands the predicament that she's in. She understands that this district attorney's office has a lot of power and a lot of leverage over her, and she better make them happy. And so she has every reason to do or say the things that are going. And so through this investigation, the police have received information that was not completely true, was not completely reliable. And sort of the bad inputs make bad output. So if I have a soup that I'm making, I put all these ingredients in, but I got some in there that are rotten or no good, that affects the whole thing. That affects the entirety of it. And so that's what the state's presented to you. They presented to you this case with certain things that don't make sense and that impacts the entirety of that case and should cause you to have doubts about it. So let's talk about the timeline. And I think that the purpose of readdressing that issue this morning was to try and make it less confusing. I came out of it more confused. But basically what the state's theory is that there is someone who rides through the Horizon subdivision and goes past 109, 19, 69th Street, and they're going westbound at that time towards the park. Now yesterday, Detective Kennedy said when we were watching the video that didn't have a timestamp, he said that happens at approximately 2 o'clock, that an individual with a gray sweatshirt and jeans is riding westbound. Now the state is saying, no, it wasn't really 2 o'clock. When we put it on this different player, it shows a different time. It shows later than that, closer to 2:08, 2:10. And so the timeline shifts depending on what media player it's on. But you know what we saw yesterday. We saw a video from 109, 19, 69th Street. And Detective Kennedy said there's a person going westbound. On the timer for that player, it happens at 35 seconds. On cross-examination, I said, can you please move it up to 54 minutes and 37 seconds? And there's a person going eastbound. We're not playing a trick on you. That you saw it, okay? But the state puts it on a different player, uses a different computer, and everything gets kind of confusing. And so the point of that is I think there's reasons to be very skeptical about a timeline, because the things that the state, well, Detective Kennedy said approximately 2 o'clock, then it changed. We have this new player. The new player changes around kind of what we see as far as time goes, and then what that means for the state's timeline. And so things are not as clear as the state wants you to believe on their timeline. What the state believes happened is they're saying that Mr. Fuller goes into the home, shoots Kaylee Juga, shoots Stephanie Juga, comes out at 3 o'clock, runs westbound, finds someplace where nobody's going to notice, changes clothes, gets on a bike, and then they have him at 109, 19, 69th Street, they say, at 3:03. That's not a lot of time to do all those things. And Detective Kennedy said, well, I think it would take this long to ride a bike to here, or to run from here, and to get to this place, to that place. But ultimately, it's your choice, and it's your decision. You don't have to take the testimony of Detective Kennedy, just as you don't have to agree with or take as true the testimony of any witness. It's up to you to decide for yourself. And then let's talk about the physical evidence. Yesterday, Detective Kennedy looked at the video. He showed you the video. He said, I can't tell the gender of the person in that video outside of the Juga home. I can't tell the race of that person. Now, he does say that he can see blonde tips on dreadlocks of someone riding a bike on the video from 109 1969th Street. Again, you get to decide that. Okay, my eyes are not the greatest, but I can't see it, okay? If I got my contacts in, I'm not that far away, I can't see it. You get to decide whether you can, okay? But I don't think it's there. And so again, you get to decide, is the person who I see on this bicycle and the person who goes into the Juga house, is that the same person? And there were some comparisons they did. It's your decision, okay? Because Detective Kennedy says, well, when I compare this, I compare that, you don't have to listen to him if you don't want to. You get to decide. You also heard Officer Valeri testify about ejection patterns and different things at the crime scene. And what I just want to highlight is that when she comes to the scene, she knows what she sees when she gets there. She doesn't know how things get to their final landing place. We've got a projectile on the stairs. We've got a casing down on the first floor. So she can say that's where they are when I see them or when I recover them, but she has no idea the story of how they got there, how they traveled there. And let's talk about the tool marks. So I think the first thing that's important to highlight is that there's an assumption that kind of overarches tool mark examination, and that is that every gun leaves distinctive markings. So although there may be thousands of the same type of gun, same manufacturer, same caliber, and even maybe manufactured one after another, that each one of them would leave a unique and distinctive marking that this examiner can identify on a small object, on a projectile or on a casing. And that there's going to be, that each one of those would leave that unique and distinctive marking. So we talked about what's the standard or what's the evaluation that happens. And so the examiner looks at this object on the left, looks at this object on the right through a high-powered microscope, but they're looking at the two things. And it's up to them to decide what I see here looks the same as what I see here, or it looks similar enough that I think that there is sufficient agreement. So the tool mark examiner, Ms. Williams, she said it's a match. That's not exactly what the standard is. The standard is, does she believe there's sufficient agreement between this one and that one? And sufficient agreement, if you remember, has this long and confusing definition. That is, when it exceeds the best agreement demonstrated between tool marks known to have been produced by different tools and is consistent with the agreement demonstrated by tool marks known to have been produced by the same tool. So when she says match, that's not what it is. She's saying there's sufficient agreement when I look at this thing on this side and this thing on this side, and I've examined them with my own eyeballs, and that's the decision that I've made. It relies an awful lot on her. It relies on the fallibility of humans, of us as people. The state has described what it says is stalking behavior. You have not received an instruction about making a decision about whether Mr. Fuller stalked Kaylee Juga. He is not charged with that offense. It's a diversion. It's to gain sympathy and appeal to your fear in this case. Your decision is to look at the three charges that Mr. Fuller is charged with and decide whether the state has met its burden beyond a reasonable doubt for those three charges. It is not to decide whether he was engaged in this stalking type behavior or this domestic violence behavior that the state says that he did. So as I said when I started, there's some big holes in the state's case. There's those lingering doubts and questions. What about the close? What about the timeline? Was Stephanie Juga's memory able to take in this information? Was she able to be accurate in her reporting under the stress, panic, and fear that she was under? Can we trust what the witnesses have told us? Do we trust the things that the state has presented for their timeline? All of those things. And so those things are here, and those are doubts. They create the doubts in this case, those reasonable doubts. So again, it's the state's burden. It's their job to prove their case to you beyond a reasonable doubt. And they haven't done that. And so we ask you to return verdicts of not guilty. Thank you.